Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to today's Warren Distinguished Seminar. It's my great honor to be here to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Elowyn Yager. So Dr. Elowyn Yager is currently a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and also the co-director of the Center for Ecohydraulics at the University of Idaho. She obtained her bachelor degree in geology at SUNY Buffalo and her PhD degree in geology at the University of California, Berkeley. Her study covers a range of topics related to the mechanics of geomorphology, including from grain scale to land scale, including sediment and nutrient transport, hill slope erosion, and the interactions between ecohydraulics and the geomorphology. I have known Elowyn for many years since I was a graduate student, always inspired by your research and your drive to consistently push the field forward. And Elowyn has won a lot of awards for her research, teaching, and outreach, including NSF Career Awards and the Fulbright Fellowship. I'm very looking forward to your talk about how to identify signal from the noise of sediment transport measurements, and especially using different tools, including AI. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Judy. Thank you all for coming today. And I'm really happy to be here. I also want to acknowledge the many co-authors on this talk, and there's so many because this is sort of a mashup of a bunch of different studies. And I also want to acknowledge NSF, who's funded everything you'll see here today. So what I'm going to be talking about is bedload transport, which of course is the movement of rock along riverbed. And it's important for many reasons, from influencing habitat for a range of aquatic species like caddisflies and fish that we eat, to influencing river stability, like if you have a flood, is the river going to erode into someone's house, influencing sedimentation rates and reservoirs, which then control our ability to provide flood control, irrigation water, and hydropower. And then finally, if we think about really long time scales, bedload transport is influencing the form of rivers, like charismatic places like the Grand Canyon on the top and a slot canyon in Utah. And so it has a wide variety of impacts, from short to long time scales, from organisms to human infrastructure to just fun things that we like to investigate. But it's problematic in that even though we've had probably over 150 years of research on bedload transport, we're still not doing a great job in our predictions. So I've just made this cartoon to illustrate this point, where if we have a measurement of sediment transport rate plotted as a function of shear stress, it's nonlinear, and particularly when we're near the onset of motion, which is this critical shear stress, that's representing when the stress that we need to just start moving sediment. When we're near that onset of motion, we can see sediment transport can vary by orders of magnitude. And we're using critical shear stress as a simplification. This is what a lot of people use in the field. It's not my favorite variable, but it's a simplifying one that everyone likes to use. So we're going to be consistent with the literature on that. Now, if we made a prediction, let's say in yellow, we would have okay predictions at high shear stresses, but when we get close to the onset of motion, we can have orders of magnitude error if we simply assume an incorrect value of this critical shear stress because of this nonlinear relation in transport. And if we look at how we choose a critical shear stress, we're essentially choosing a value, in my opinion, out of a hat. So this is a data compilation conducted by Lam et al. In 2008. They plotted that critical shear stress as a function of channel slope. And I know your eyes are drawn to that relation you're seeing, but I want you to just forget about that. We're not going to talk about it. It would be the subject of an entirely different talk. Instead, what I want you to do is focus on that scatter we see for a given slope. And if you look at the y-axis, we have about an order of magnitude scatter in that critical shear stress. And there's some equations that people use to estimate the critical shear stress within that scatter. But really, what a lot of practitioners are doing are they like a certain value, and they'll choose that value. And so this is problematic in that, of course, if you're choosing something within an order of magnitude scatter, and you're putting it into a nonlinear equation, you're going to have really inaccurate predictions. Furthermore, we've now recently realized that the critical shear stress even varies within a given stream, which we've always assumed is a constant within a given river. So this is measured values of critical shear stress as a function of time from the Erlenbach torrent in Switzerland, where they have records of sediment transport going back to the 1980s. So they continuously measure transport for many years. And this was a collaboration with Claire Masteller, who led this study, where we found that we can have, again, almost an order of magnitude scatter in critical shear stress within a given river. And ignore all the colors. The main point is looking at that y-axis. And so even within a given river where we thought we had some certainty, and if we measure the critical shear stress, we can make a prediction. What this is saying is that we don't actually have that certainty. And that's also highly problematic. And so what I'm hoping to do today is explain what we consider to be noise in critical shear stress with some mechanics of particle motion. And that will hopefully help us improve our predictions. And so what I'm going to break it down into is just a simple balance of driving and resisting forces. You could use moments if you wanted. It doesn't really matter. The main concepts are there are things that are influencing the particle motion. There are things that are resisting particle motion. And I'm looking at individual particle scale because decades of research have now shown that when we're at the onset of motion, the movements essentially of individual separate particles. We're not having the whole movement of an entire granular bed. That's really only happening when we're at high flood stages. And so if we want to better estimate critical shear stress, we need to look at the individual particle scale and then use that to help us predict transport, let's say at the reach scale. So normally when we calculate lift and drag, we're using time average quantities. But recent studies, including excellent work done by Judy, have said that we really need to include turbulence. So for example, many of you I think are using PIV, but this is a video from PIV, particle imaging velocimetry, where we have neutrally buoyant particles seated in the flow. They're moving with the velocity of the flow, and we're holding everything constant in this video. And this sphere is essentially experiencing those turbulent fluctuations, which you'll see just by watching those particles move up and down, which I find this mesmerizing. I could probably spend all day watching a video like this. And you see the awesome wake behind that particle, and eventually it's going to roll out of its pocket. There we go, right? Very exciting. So active sediment transport, why did it roll out of its pocket just then? It did it because of turbulent fluctuations. It wasn't like we increased the discharge or anything. It was the turbulence that caused it to move. And so this is not a new concept, but we want to dig further into, is turbulence really needed to predict the onset of motion accurately? So that's our first question. Our second question is, what controls particle resistance to motion? So if you think we're simplifying lift and drag, we're doing an even more simple calculation of the resisting force, which I'll talk about a little later. And then how can we use this information to make informed estimates of critical shear stress in gravel bed rivers, and particularly make simple measurements that anyone could go out and use to have a calculated value. So we're going to start with the first question, and we're going to go to the Center for Ecohydraulics Stream Lab, which is 20 meters long, 2 meters wide, and can go up to a slope of 10%. It's not as big as the Flume and Saffel. I'm a little jealous, but it does have some great capabilities. And everything I'm going to present today is from former PhD student Heidi Smith. And so if we drill down into the specific questions she's asking, is turbulence needed to accurately predict particle motion? And then how do we properly quantify turbulence that affects motion? That is, how would we properly include turbulence in a calculation of motion to accurately predict it? And she's going to answer this question by using highly simplified experiments. She's constructed a mobile test sphere. So this is essentially something that she adds weight to, so it has the proper density. And that test sphere, it's 50 centimeters in diameter. It sits on a tripod of 3 force sensors, and those 3 force sensors serve 2 purposes. They tell us precisely when that test sphere rolls out of its pocket, and it also sets the pocket geometry to be constant. Then she has 7 micropressure sensors she's installed within the test sphere, and we're only going to, though, look at 4 of them. We're going to do a highly simplified calculation where we calculate drag force as a difference in pressure between the upstream and downstream sensor, and lift force as a difference in pressure between the top and the bottom. And we're going to calculate both instantaneous, so through time, drag and lift forces, as well as time average lift and drag forces. Simultaneously, she has 3D planar PIV over her particle along the center line. So this would be a contour map of velocities you would see from that PIV. And she's going to calculate lift and drag just using simplified general lift and drag equations we have. And again, she's going to calculate instantaneous and time average lift and drag using a velocity profile 1 diameter upstream of the particle. So what I'm going to show to you is a simplification of all these results. I'm just going to throw them all into some highly simple cartoons because there's a lot going on here, but I'm going to present the overall results if we look at either lift and drag calculated with pressure or velocity. So the first question is turbulence needed to accurately predict particle motion? And we're just going to take the simplest approach, say, let's forget we even know about turbulence. Doesn't exist. Let's just calculate lift and drag using time average values. And we're going to do just simple force balance. We account for the slope of the channel, the angle through which the particle needs to pivot. We can use the combination of lift and drag and compare it to the resisting force. And in theory, if our particle is moving, that lift and drag should exceed or equal the resisting force. So we do this for 24 particle motions that she measured. And we say, did this time average lift and drag exceed particle motion? And that happened for 0% of her motions. So essentially, the way we're calculating particle motion in our simple time average calculations will never work. She observed, sorry, it's mic keeps falling, 24 motions, and we could never predict that they actually occurred. So this is really problematic, and it adds to the literature that's saying we must include turbulence if we want accurate estimates of critical shear stress. So that's great. We need to include it, but how do we actually quantify that turbulence so that we can make simple calculations of critical shear stress? So we're going to do a slightly more complicated calculation now, and that if we're looking at, for example, a record of drag force over time, these are instantaneous drags calculated either with pressure or velocity. We're going to look at the record anytime before rotation. We know precisely when the particle moved, and then we know the time during its rotation. Yes.
You said that drag did not overwhelm this. That's all from sensory data, or is a combination of velocity data and data? Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Kimberly. Yeah, so it's either if we calculate lift and drag using the pressures and we compare it to resisting forces, or we calculate it using velocity and compare it to resisting forces. Either way, we never predict the particle would have moved.
And that's like instantaneous velocities and instantaneous forces.
Oh no, this is time average.
Time average.
Time average. So we're ignoring turbulence entirely. So if we use time average pressures, time average velocities, we would never predict particle motion would occur. Yeah, thanks for the question. Anything else unclear? Okay. So now we're going to include those instantaneous values. So before we're just using time averaged, now we're going to include instantaneous values and see, can we estimate the onset of motion? So we're going to say lift or drag explains a given particle motion if its value is higher at the start of rotation or during rotation than any time previously in the record. So why are we doing that? Let me just make a simple example of this. Let's say this was our record of drag. Here we see the highest peak in the circle, and then there are much lower drag forces after that peak. So if drag were responsible for motion, then our particle should have moved here instead of moving there. And so this means essentially drag couldn't explain motion because the peak didn't occur somewhat coincident with particle motion. Conversely, if we have a peak now sometime at rotation or during rotation, we will say that drag will explain motion because that peak coincides with particle motion. So it's just a simplified comparison of, is that peak in drag or lift higher anytime before rotation than during rotation? So if we compile essentially all the results from pressures or velocities, and we look at them simplified way, here we say, is the lift force before motion greater than during rotation? And that happened for 96% of our motions for either pressure or drag, essentially. So it didn't matter how we calculated it. So that means lift force could only explain 4% of our motions. It was only highest during rotation 4% of the time. And that means we might be able to neglect lift force in our calculation, which is great because it reduces one thing we need to worry about. But there are some caveats about these specific experimental conditions. that might depend on whether you can neglect lift or not. And I'm happy to chat about it later. I'm just going to breeze through that though. If someone wants to know about it, I'm happy to ask a question about it. So drag force was greater before motion than during rotation for 47% of our motions. So this means we could only explain particle motion for 53% of her 20-something particle movements. So we're only explaining about half of the particle motions using these measures of either velocity or pressure. And some of you might know about impulse, which other people are using to estimate the onset of motion and incorporates the effect of both magnitude and duration, let's say, of drag forces. If we use impulse, we can only explain up to 70% of the motion. So even using the concept that we need a long duration drag event, we still cannot fully explain all particle motions that we see. So why is this? Well, we think about the flow field, which is shown from this PIV video, that what's going on around a particle. The flow field is constantly changing around the entire particle. And when we're calculating pressure, we're just using 2 points for either lift or drag. We're not including that entire pressure distribution around a particle. And we've also observed that our separation point, because we have a sphere, is moving up and downstream during our particle rotation and beforehand. But we're not accounting for either of those things in our calculations. And so what we think might be necessary are actually 3D measurements like TOMO or volumetric PIV, which we now have, but we didn't have when Heidi was making her measurements, or using some full pressure distribution around the particle, or possibly if we're using velocities, having a temporally variable drag coefficient, which other people have suggested might help improve estimates. So the end result here is somewhat unsatisfying and essentially means even with all these measurements that I've taken, which are way more than anyone would ever measure in the field, people don't even measure velocity when they're trying to estimate the onset of motion. We still cannot accurately estimate the movement of this highly simplified sphere. And so the end takeaway is that we might need some more complicated estimates of turbulence to accurately estimate the particle of motion, but how we do that and how we make it easy for people to apply is still an open question. So moving on now, we're going to ask, what controls the particle resistance to motion? We're going to completely forget about turbulence. We don't care about turbulence. Flow doesn't matter. We're just going to focus on what's resisting particle motion. And if we think about, at least in the field of bedload transport, how people represent resisting forces, it's essentially a function of the grain weight and an angle through which a particle needs to pivot. Or sometimes it represents sliding. But this is about the extent of how we commonly represent it in bedload transport. Now, if we look at a real stream, you'll see that that is way too simplified. So we have particles that are partially buried by other sediments. That's adding a resisting force to those particles where that needs to be overcome, or you first need to move this burying particle for the other one to move. And we also have things like interlocking with other grains that we know well from the granular mechanics literature is really important. We also have things like cohesion in the field that add additional resisting forces. And so all of this is pointing to the fact that we're not representing what's actually going on within a real river. And so what we're going to try and do is incorporate those two effects by using an internal or intergranular friction angle or coefficient, which is commonly used in other fields, and then a protrusion, which is the amount a particle sticks up above the bed to represent the effects of burial. We're going to add that to the pivot angle and grain weight effect. So this motivates two sub-questions within this part of the talk. The first is, do protrusion and internal friction angle control grain resistance to motion? And can a theory that incorporates those effects improve our predictions? We're going to answer this using 3 different types of techniques. The first one is a discrete element method model. It's lights and lamps. And what we're going to do is fix these bottom 3 spheres in the model to create a constant particle pocket geometry. So it has a constant pivot angle in theory. There's no flow whatsoever in this model. Remember, I'm saying ignore flow. Flow doesn't exist. We don't care about flow. And we're going to apply a constant external force to our sphere. And we're going to keep increasing that force until the sphere moves out of its pocket. And that tells us what is the resisting force. So you're going to see it's going to move. And as it's moving, it's interacting with those smaller spheres that are helping to provide that intergranular resistance. Again, super exciting. Spheres rolling out of pockets. This one's more interesting. We've colored the sphere by its velocity and all the other particles it's interacting with by their velocity as it's rolling out of its pocket.
Spheres are all rigid.
Yes.
That's a small.
Oh, they do have a small deformation. Yeah, yeah. Sorry. And so then essentially we're going to estimate the resisting force for our different protrusions. And we're going to do this by progressively burying our sphere with more and more fine sediment. So essentially we'll bury it from, this is the lowest, about 10%, all the way up to 90%. And of course, a particle wouldn't actually be moving when it's fully buried, but we're just going to see what happens when we have that really high protrusion. Then we're going to conduct some highly complex lab experiments using glued superballs. So these are essentially just adding some complexity to what we had in our DEM simulations, where we have that same configuration of stable spheres, which are represented by these glued yellow balls. And we have an orange ball sitting on top that we're interested in, and it's going to be buried with either sand or gravel. The pivot angle is set by those two bottom spheres. We're going to bury it with different amounts of sand or gravel to vary its protrusion. We're going to measure its resisting force with a load cell. So we just push on that sphere with a load cell until it rolls out of its pocket. And this is the tiny little load cell we're using to push on that sphere. We also use that load cell in 3 different field sites that each have 100 grains that we push on each. So these are just grains that are sitting naturally on the bed. We push on those grains until they move out of their pocket and record the maximum force needed to move them, which we assume is the resisting force. We also measure their protrusion, grain size, and weight. So if we throw all those data together in one figure, I'm going to explain the figure. It's a lot going on, and then we'll talk about the results. So we have resisting force normalized by weight to eliminate that weight effect, plotted against protrusion. High protrusion means the particle sticks up a lot above the bed. We have the DEM simulation of spheres moving past spheres. We have our lab of spheres moving past sand, lab of spheres moving past gravel, and then finally the field is all 3 sites combined, where now we couldn't control protrusion, it was whatever it was in the field, and so those are median values for a given bin of protrusion. And the first thing you'll note is that as we essentially increase protrusion, our resisting force declines. It makes sense. Less buried particles are easier to move. They have lower resisting forces. The next thing to note is if we compare between these different results, we also have about an order of magnitude change in resisting force. So we go from spheres to slightly angular sand to even more angular gravel to then a mix of angularities with cohesion and all these other effects that we can't control for in the field. And so in general, what we're doing here is increasing angularity as we go up in this plot, and we're seeing an increase in our resisting force. Now, this means essentially we're increasing our internal friction angle, which is what we had hypothesized. So we see that in protrusion and internal friction angle are controlling grain resistance to motion. So then how do we incorporate these effects in just a simple theory that anyone could use? We're going to start from just simple force, pivot angle, grain weight. Everyone uses that. We're going to add a component of internal friction. So this is just a force that incorporates that internal friction angle, incorporates the burial as well of the particle that's experiencing that internal friction. And then we also have a force due to the weight of the overlying sediment. And in this case, we're assuming spherical particles. And we assume spherical particles from just simple geometric considerations. We can calculate, if we know protrusion, what proportion of the particle has some weight on it. And assuming a density, we can get that weight of the overlying sediment. So essentially, we add these 3 forces together, and that gives us our total calculated resisting force. And the only thing we need to do for this is measure protrusion, assume an internal friction angle, and know the pivot angle. So these are the same data that I showed you earlier. I've removed the field data for now. I'll come back to it in a minute. We have resisting force weight versus protrusion, spheres past spheres, spheres past sand, spheres past gravel. If we're to use what everyone else in bedload transport is using to calculate the resisting force, we would get that horizontal red line. So we'd predict essentially one resisting force for everything on the bed, everything, all the data you see here. So it's not incorporating the effects of protrusion, and it's not incorporating these different essentially singularity effects. Now, if we use our theory, we need to give it an assumed internal friction angle, which are those different colored lines. And you see what we're doing is generally capturing that decrease in resisting force with higher protrusion, which is great. And if we focus on, for example, sand, we want to accurately estimate those resisting forces. We need to assume an external friction angle of about 30 degrees, which isn't horrible for sand. So we're doing a decent job in terms of what internal friction angles we need to assume to obtain accurate predictions of our resisting forces. Now going to the field, for the field, we have all these particles we're measuring. We couldn't control protrusion. So what we're going to do is just look at the distribution of resisting forces divided by weight for one of the field sites. So this is measured values in black. So that's a measured resisting force distribution for 100 particles. And then in red is what we would calculate if we only used pivot angle and grain weight. In this case, we don't know pivot angle, and we assume a distribution of pivot angles from literature. So we're massively underestimating our resisting forces using the previous theory. And here we overlay our predictions. Again, each different colored line is a different assumed internal friction angle. And we can get a decent prediction of our resisting forces for most of the distribution, depending on what internal friction angle we assume. But most importantly, I want to focus on where the circle is. If you look down here, it doesn't really matter so much what internal friction angle we assume. And that's really important because these are essentially the lowest percentiles of the resisting force distribution. Lowest percentiles of this distribution are the most easily mobile particles. Most easily mobile particles are what we're trying to capture in the onset of motion. And so this is suggesting, and this happens for all three of our field sites, that maybe our internal friction angle doesn't matter so much if we want to capture this low end of the distribution, which is most important for the onset of motion. But we want to capture the entire distribution. So all those particles that are potentially mobile at some point on the bed, we need to use an angle of about 66 degrees, which is equivalent to what people have measured in some field soil tests that incorporate both the effects of cohesion as well as wide distributions of particles ranging from silt and clay all the way to cobbles, which is what we had at this field site. So we think we're getting a reasonable prediction of our resisting forces using okay assumptions about our internal friction angle. So we find we do need to include internal friction and protrusion, and we can improve predictions of resistance. So now let's try and bring this all together to say, how can we make informed estimates of critical shear stress in gravel-bedded rivers? So let's go back to that one of those motivating figures. We have critical shear stress over time. We had large temporal variations in critical shear stress. So we're going to try and use this framework we've set up to answer the question, why do we have these large temporal variations? So if we think about the bed structure we've been talking throughout this talk, we could have a low critical shear stress, so easily mobile sediment, when we have a bed that is not well packed together. Particles have high protrusion. They have low angles, either pivot angles or internal friction angles. And recent studies have suggested that if we could have a long duration low flow event, that long duration low flow event could subtly move particles into more stable positions. It can't move the entire bed, but it might move a few particles here or there. And what that's going to do is increase the packing of the bed, increase that structure, and it could decrease protrusion and increase essentially our internal friction angle. Conversely, we could start with a bed with a high critical shear stress and move to a bed with a low critical shear stress after a large flood event. And what that large flood event is going to do is going to move all the grains on the bed, essentially fluff up that bed, destroy its structure, and then we would result in having a high protrusion and low angles. So what we're trying to do right now is test this hypothesis in a bunch of lab experiments, but because the student just started being able to conduct experiments, I can't show you the actual results on testing our hypothesis. But what I can do is show you how we're going to use this hypothesis to make predictions of critical shear stress. So what we're going to do is combine essentially those two topics that we're talking about, and we're going to make a calculation of critical shear stress using assumed and measured values. So our resisting forces, you all know these now, we went over them already. In order to estimate resisting forces, we need to assume pivot angles, which we can get from the literature. We need to assume some reasonable value of internal friction angles, but we do need to measure protrusion and grain size. Now for our driving forces, again, I said we don't really know how to accurately capture the effects of turbulence and estimating these simplified driving forces. So right now we're going to go back to what other people have done and use a velocity profile equation for the roughness layer. We're going to add a component of turbulence in the form of a turbulence intensity to that time average velocity, and that's going to allow us to calculate lift and drag on the particle. Now, importantly, protrusion is also controlling lift and drag because it's controlling the exposed area of the particle to the flow, which then is incorporated in our lift and drag equations. So protrusion is important for both driving and resisting forces. So in total, we need to use a bunch of equations that we have from the literature, an assumption about internal friction, and we need measurements of protrusion and grain size. So what I'm going to show you right now is just a simplified calculation using all of these equations. And if we only vary protrusion in that calculation, what happens to our critical shear stress? So we plotted this calculated critical shear stress normalized by the critical shear stress when protrusion is 100, just to get rid of the factor of scaling on the y-axis. And then we have a % protrusion. The main thing I want you to know is that if we simply vary protrusion from 10% to 100%, we can get 3 orders of magnitude variation in critical shear stress. And that's because of its effect on both driving and resisting forces. And so in the field, we mentioned between streams, we have about an order of magnitude variation in critical shear stress. Within a stream, we have about an order of magnitude variation in critical shear stress. So that means we could simply use protrusion. If protrusion varies over time, protrusion varies between different streams, we could easily explain an order of magnitude variation by just explaining it through protrusion. Now, of course, other things are varying, like internal friction and probably all these other factors that we haven't even incorporated. But this is just to make the case that a simple measurement of protrusion could be used to explain our variation. So how do we make this actually applicable to other people who don't want to go through all these calculations? Well, essentially, it's in press right now. We have a paper that's called ProPlus, which essentially does all these calculations for you. It'll make all these assumptions, and what it needs to do is calculate protrusion and grain size. And how is it doing that? Conveniently, there was a recent study published in 2023 that is estimating grain size from point clouds. And the reason why this is important is because most previous estimates of grain size, like from photogrammetry, are just from a photograph. But a photograph isn't necessarily providing us the vertical elevation that we need for protrusion. And so the study by Steer et al. Found a way to estimate grain size from point clouds by essentially running a fake watershed routing algorithm on the bed and segmenting grains by assuming each grain is its own watershed. Then it combines grains or divides grains based on some algorithms and fits ellipsoids to them to estimate the grain size. This has only been tested in this one study, and so we thought this would be a great input to ProPlus, as well as a way to test it in our paper. So the idea here is if we look at this as an orthomosaic, we have G3 point giving the point cloud associated with each grain. So let's say it's this grain that I've outlined in white. And then what ProPlus is going to do is calculate the protrusion for that grain by knowing its point cloud and the surrounding bed point cloud. And then it's going to do that for every single grain we can see within the point cloud. And it's then going to calculate critical shear stress. So in this way, we get a critical shear stress distribution for the entire bed. Now, how do we get grain point clouds, and how is that easy for people? Well, in the last 10 years, I'm sure many of you know, this idea of using photographs to obtain bed topography has exploded. So if you take a number of photographs, you can put it into structure from motion software like AgiSoft MeasureShape. And as long as you have a scale in that photo, you can construct a bed topography. So for example, these are DEMs that we constructed in the lab from taking about 100 photographs of this area. It has a resolution of less than 1 millimeter. And so the idea here then is if someone wants to go out to a stream and estimate critical shear stress, they take photographs of the bed, they put those photographs in AgiSoft MeasureShape, they take the topography or point cloud from AgiSoft MeasureShape, put it in G3 Point, and then put that output into ProPlus. So there's a lot of steps, but this would only take, if you know what you're doing, about 1 to 2 days in total from making a bunch of measurements, photographs in the field. That takes like 20 minutes, right? Like all these steps would not take much time. And so if you're thinking about practically estimating a critical shear stress, having an informed estimate, this would not be that time intensive for someone to do. And so what we wanted to do is test this method in laboratory experiments. So that's essentially what I'm showing you here. I'm going to zoom in on this part of the figure. We're going to run all those calculations on that one area. And what this is going to do is give us a critical shear stress distribution for each grain size. So essentially you can think of those colors as distribution for every grain size on the bed. And we have a distribution because all those particles can fit in different pocket geometries, have different protrusions, etc. Now we need to test this using actual measurements of critical shear stress, right? This is just a prediction. So to do that, for those same in laboratory experiments, we measured actual bedload transport rates using this bedload sampler. And what that does is we have rocks rolling along the bed. They get captured by this apparatus and they go into a net. So we're capturing the movement of a range of different grain sizes and using the reference transport rate, which I know is just lingo for people in sediment transport. I'm just throwing that out there. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer the details of how we get a critical shear stress using these measurements. But essentially, we can use these measurements to get a critical shear stress for each grain size. We plot that as a function of the relative grain size, the grain size divided by the D50. So these are essentially our measured values. And you'll note we're getting one value for each grain size. And that's because really most of our methods for getting critical shear stress ignore the fact we have distributions of grains on the bed. We just say, okay, here's the one value for this one grain size. Now, with our predictions, we have a distribution. And so to make a comparison between a distribution and a single value, we need to assume certain percentiles of that distribution represent what we're measuring here. And what people commonly do is assume low percentiles of this distribution correspond to what we measure because low percentiles of the critical shear stress are the most easily mobile grains. They're what we're most likely to capture in this trap. So I've used the first percentile and the fifth percentile just as simple checks of our predictions. You can see we're generally doing an okay job in getting that change in critical shear stress with grain size. We're getting okay magnitudes, but there are definitely some errors here. And I want to throw this out here. I only did this by really doing a lot of calibration, right? So I could not make this prediction unless I tweaked a bunch of parameters in ProPlus. So that's really problematic because the whole point of this is not to do calibration. It's to make an actual prediction without any measurements. So why did this happen? Was it an error in what I've done? I don't think so. What I think is going on is our grain identification was not very good. So not ours, but that of G3 Point. So here I'm showing you the DEM. Here's a corresponding orthomosaic. I've manually outlined every individual grain. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And then this is what G3 Point is showing. So it's outlines of the grains, and you'll know it's doing an okay job, but it's not great. For example, in the blue circle, essentially we're lumping multiple grains together. And more importantly, in this orange circle, we are dividing this grain into many smaller grains. And this is really problematic for critical shear stress calculations because we're saying there's a bunch of these tiny particles sitting on top of this large grain, which of course would never happen in the real world. And in addition, those particles have high protrusion, so they have really low critical shear stresses. So we're changing our distribution of critical shear stresses simply by misidentifying particles. So that led my current PhD student to look at meta AI. So this is called Segment Everything. And what you're going to see are a series of prompts that it gives to try and find objects. And because you have a large snowstorm here, I tried to say springy things to inspire you. So fruit from the garden, tulips, well, that one's not anything inspiring, it's just the sidewalk. But as it's progressing, you see it's doing a really good job at identifying this fruit. This is with no calibration, no user essentially interaction. It's doing an okay job with the tulips. It's getting some of the heads, but it's missing others, and it's not getting the individual stems. And if you were to look at the sidewalk at first blush, it looks great, but it's missing all the individual cobbles. And so I was not involved in this, but Zoltan Sylvester figured out that one of the problems with this is that the prompts, so you have to give it these white prompts, are not relatively accurate. It's just giving prompts at a regular spacing. And you need an informed location for those prompts. And so he constructed a way to have an informed location of the prompt by doing a first pass of grain identification. That first pass of grain identification then provides prompts from this meta AI, which then in theory would provide more accurate grain inputs. If you're interested, this is a link to his GitHub code. And so we're going to test this to identify grains now to improve our Pro Plus predictions. So this is a different experiment. It's now being conducted by PhD student Sebastian Bernal. Here's an orthomosaic of a small area of the experiment. Here's what we get if we run G3 point on that. Now the different colors represent different grains. Again, you see not a great job. And then no calibration, no user feedback, no input. This is what we get from segment every grain. So it's really doing an amazing job at identifying individual grains. Some grains, like here, lumping together 3 particles, but compared to G3 point, it's fantastic. And this is great because it allows us now, even though this is running just on an unscaled photograph, we can use an orthomosaic as an input to segment every grain, take the outputs, which are just essentially grain locations, and make our own code to essentially find the grain perimeter coordinates in a scaled orthomosaic. And we're going to now fit ellipsoids, estimate the grain size. We're throwing out G3 point, and we're now going with the segment every grain. And then we're just going to use all those as inputs to our Pro Plus. So that's our next step. And what we hope is that this will allow anyone just go out, take some photos, put it into segment every grain after you get an orthomosaic, and then we can calculate critical shear stresses and protrusions in a river. So what I hope to have convinced you today is that we have a large variation in critical shear stress between rivers. And this is really problematic because it's quite huge. And some of that scatter we think can be explained by turbulent fluctuations, protrusion, and internal friction angles. Of course, there's many other things going on that would contribute to that scatter, but we're hoping that by including some of those effects in our predictions, we'll be able to have informed estimates of a given stream instead of just essentially randomly picking a value out of a hat from this scatter. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the great talk. We have time for questions.
Great talk. I have a question, a naive question. When we talk about stress, we always define a continuum sense. And then when you do analysis, you use discrete particles. Do you use any length scale to homogenize the result of the particle analysis to continuum definition of stress?
Okay, yeah. So we incorporate, essentially we're averaging, it's over the area of the particle.
So thanks a lot, Ellen. Fantastic, very inspiring. I want to ask you to speculate a little bit. You started motivating us by the comment about the sensitivity of sediment transport to the critical value. Now that you've done a lot of work to improve estimation of the critical value, what do you think, where do you think that will lead in terms of improving sediment transport? Can we use the same formulas just with a better critical stress, or do you think a similar level of effort would have to be put into the, the rest of the calculation?
I'll give you my PR answer, and then I'll give you my honest answer. So PR answer is yes, in theory, if we improve the estimates of critical shear stress, that's the most uncertain parameter in these calculations. And if you have a better estimate, you could improve bedload transport equations. You could probably use the same bedload equation. Honest answer is, honestly, I'm not a huge even fan of putting things in terms of a stress in general, because I don't really think that that's what's controlling motion. It's these turbulent fluctuations around the particle and like the actual velocities on the particle. And if I really wanted to get into really accurate predictions, I'd have to do a deep dive into like some of the things Kimberly is doing to really improve predictions, but that's not going to happen in a practical sense. So I think there are ways we can make improvements without doing that, such as using distributions of things. Like right now, we're assuming like we have one value of critical shear stress, put everything in terms of one value of critical shear stress, but everything is a distribution. And if we somehow were able to incorporate distributions of stresses or forces, then I think we would have a better estimate. But I think that's a few ways down the road. And also going back to the continuum question, I've actually had large debates with some people that should we even be representing bedload transport as a continuum process in general, because we have such low sample sizes, it's going of particles moving. It's really, we're making a large assumption about that, and it might be inaccurate. So, but that's essentially throwing out the whole baby with the bathwater if we're doing that, and we would need to start from an entirely different approach. So long answer, I think it will improve it. Will it make it perfect? Definitely not.
Elowyn, great talk. Thank you so much. And as you were answering Chris's question, it sort of evolved into part of the answer, I think, to my question. But I think that my question is sort of a discretized version of Chris's question, because I knew you told me you don't like the stress framework, and yet you sort of structured everything in terms of the stress framework, but it's everything that's about that critical shear stress. And I wonder if you sort of picture in the long run, if we were going to, like you were going to say, I am going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because actually it's not a really viable baby. Sorry, I don't want to it's too weird about this, but if we if we were going to say it is time to do this, would you say, like, to me, I could see there's the probabilistic critical shear stress of, it seems like you're heading toward of the bed, right? That is more like a probabilistic form. So you can't have a single critical shear stress. That has to be somehow probabilistic. Then you have the shear stress itself. And by the way, the critical shear stress, it seems to me like you're just using critical shear stress as a label now. Would you say that's true? Is it so seems like the answer partly to Julian's question, that it's a label, but it's not really a stress. It's a variable thing that's a
it's, I mean, when people are estimating critical shear stress in the field, it's like from not stress that people measure on individual particle. It's a reach scale average, highly simplified stress. So it's not really what's going on. Yeah, it's a highly simplified parameter.
Do you kind of see here, I'll like make the rest of my question really fast. Do you see a probabilistic critical shear stress that's maybe governed by some information about the bed, because that'll bring in things like force change that you were illustrating, and then also a critical shear stress, then a probabilistic stress above it? Is that kind of where you might see it going if you're going to see like the generation of like the new amazing bedload transport model?
Yeah, and I think exactly that's the direction I'm trying to go, in that essentially we have distributions of those resisting forces, and we also have distributions of applied forces, and somehow applying those together. I think if it were totally up to me, I would get rid of shear stress and I would use something like velocity or a force. But it's not totally up to me, but I'll try and keep pushing that if possible.
A couple of last questions. Nikki.
It's about one thing. So the model going from protrusion to actual acting shear stress, you're assuming a drag force acting only on a portion of the grain that you
On the exposed portion of the grain.
So that will be the drag area.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I was curious how you took that into account. So the point in which a drag force is applied is not in the center of mass of the particle.
It's in the center of mass of the exposed area.
So you can calculate the torque.
Yep.
Oh, all right.
We're not calculating the torque in this, but we have tested it as well.
Yeah, because I was wondering that you visualize the motion by rotation, and then doing all this, you have a torque that you can calculate. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Maybe I'll ask two quick questions. Oh, just so curious. When you have fine, smallest particles kind of surrounding, bury the larger particle, I would imagine if you have flow, the flow would first wash out the small particles. So like the top intrusion, does that really matter?
So in terms of like the lowest protrusion particle.
Like the small particle on the top, right? I feel like they would be washed out first when you have flow.
You mean the incorrectly identified ones, or do you mean just in general with the small?
Just in general.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's an important point, and that's why we're focused on the, let me go way back. This part of the distribution here, where it's most easily mobile grains. So since those particles are sitting on top of the bigger ones, those bigger ones are probably up here, but we don't know what their resisting force will be when they're actually moving, because maybe the particles have moved, maybe it's changed their protrusion. And so trying to estimate when those larger particles or particles that are slightly buried are going to move would essentially take some sort of iterative approach where you're changing the bed structure while the other ones are moving, which is possible, but no one's actually doing that. And so that's why we're focused on the most easily mobile particles to probably estimate the critical shear stress. I don't know if that's answering your question, Judy.
Yeah, that's cool. Any question from the students? Okay, one last, maybe I have one last quick question. So DPLUS did a lot of work on like impulse. They consider it's not only the peak force, but the time duration also matters. I wonder, have you considered this?
Yeah, so we calculated impulse using drag force, using both the pressure and velocity measurements, and it only explained up to 70% of the particle motion. So it still couldn't explain all of our particle motions. And we reanalyzed some of DPLUS's data, and it seems like they also don't have a systematic like threshold of impulse that you need to cause motion of a particle. So I think impulse helps, but it doesn't entirely solve the problem.
Yeah, thank you so much for the very deep study.